You may recall a few weeks ago, my family and I were gone for a couple of Sundays, and it's because we actually took a spring break trip. And it's a trip that we were actually supposed to take last summer, but you may remember I ended up getting sick and going to the hospital for a week, and it was right before we were scheduled to leave to take that particular trip. So uh, the spring breaks lined up for the girls and Stacy this year, so we decided let's go ahead and do that again. And so um, took a trip, went to Washington D.C. For the first part of our trip, and it was my first time there. You saw some pictures earlier of the Washington Monument, and then right across from that, the Lincoln Memorial, which is where that picture was taken. And you saw several of the pictures that had inscriptions on the wall of the memorial. And one wall has his second inauguration speech engraved on the wall. The other has the Emancipation Proclamation engraved in stone on that wall. Also in Washington, D.C., we saw the Martin Luther King Memorial, and that memorial has a wall as well. And on at several points along the wall, you have inscribed excerpts from speeches that he made. Of course, Dr. King, he's known more than anything else for his words, for his speeches, and so several quotes that just spanned the length of this wall and just reminded us of just his wisdom and his courage and just how powerful his words truly were. And there were kind of several things all kind of in the same area. You had the Jefferson Memorial, which is what this is we're looking at now, and it's across this lake, I guess it is. That is the largest escalator I've ever been on my whole life. It seemed like it was like 5 or 6 stories high. It was just incredible just to be at the bottom of this escalator. But anyway, I just had to take a few pictures of that. And of course, we went to the zoos. That was really all Geneva wanted to do was on our whole trip, was just go to the zoo. And she wanted to go specifically so that we could see the pandas. And right on cue, there they are. There's the pandas, and it was just pretty fascinating to watch them. And they pretty much just were eating the whole time. That's all they did, was just eat. And so I guess that's the life of a panda. And so this is the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., a historic building, just amazing architecture. We actually went to an organ recital at this cathedral while we were there. It was pretty incredible just to be inside and to hear how the sound just kind of resounded throughout the building. And you just got a sense being in there, just a sense of connectedness with the past, with worshipers past, with Christians past. And so it was just pretty impressive, not only from an architectural standpoint, but even from a spiritual standpoint, just to be in this incredible building in Washington, D.C. From there, we went to the Air and Space Museum, which had some interesting things in it. My cousin, who lives right outside of Washington, D.C., my Aunt Catherine's daughter, her name is Katrina, she met us there, and we got to hang out with her for a little bit, so that was pretty cool. You can see the Capitol building in the background. We didn't actually go to the Capitol building. We did not make it to the White House either. That was at the National Museum of History. And then that building right there is one of the newer museums. It is the National Museum of African American History and Culture. If you've never been to this place, I would strongly recommend that before your life is over, that you go to this building. And I can't even begin to put into words what the experience was like being here. And the pictures don't do it justice, but just even the way this building is designed, it's on part of it, half of it is above the ground, the other half is below the ground, and you kind of, it kind of goes in a certain sequence, and you start off at the bottom, and what you have at the very bottom of this building is just the beginning, going all the way back to Africa and to our history as a people, even before the slave trade began. And you had just exhibits, sculptures, music, excerpts, videos. It was just a multi-sensory experience, story after story of people, individuals, events, most of whom I've never heard of, just people who for years of our history as a nation, we never knew who they were. We never knew their story. And so now we have a place where their stories are being told, where that history is being told. And that's the sense that I got being here, was just there was this untold story of America that's now being told, that we didn't get from our history books, we didn't get from just anywhere else. And so now in this museum, we have a history, and it's just, some of it was just very disturbing to see, to be honest with you, just difficult to see, and just even from a family standpoint, having young children, to see some of the things. They had a room dedicated to Emmett Till. If you know the story of Emmett Till, you know that that's a difficult story to relive and to just experience, but it was just important from a standpoint of knowing that history, just to be there, and just a lot of great things. The other half, above the ground, you start off at the bottom and you work your way up, and it kind of goes in sequence through the civil rights movement and through all the different things that happened there, leading into the modern era. And so you have on the above ground level, you have exhibits on art, history, music, Bootsy Collins, his bass, and just, you know, drama, theater. There's the mothership right there, for those of you that are into all that, the P-Funk and all that, and just art. It's just incredible. We were there the first day. We only got to be there for an hour. We had plans the next day to go on so that we can meet some friends, for some relatives actually, for dinner. But we said, you know what, we've got to go back, because there was just so much more that we hadn't seen yet. So we went back the next day and just stayed there for hours, just trying to absorb and see everything that there was to see, because it was just, we just knew we weren't going to get back there. We may not get back there anytime soon, so we wanted to just take it all in. And so artwork, I could go on and on about that part of our experience, but I just recommend that you make a point of going there at some point. And then we spent a night in Delaware, and then the next day, Thursday and Friday, we went up to New York City, saw the Statue of Liberty, Ellis Island, across the harbor there, and then the 9/11 Memorial, which is a pretty powerful thing to experience as well, to see these two basically big holes in the ground where the Twin Towers used to be, and to just know that, and you can get out of there now, Jordan, to just know that you know, that's the place where thousands of people lost their lives, thousands of people were just affected by the tragedy that took place there. And so just being there, those places, and you can bring the lights back up now, Jordan, as well. Just being there was a tremendous experience for me and my family, and we're just grateful that we were able to do that and have that experience. And these are important things in our lives. These museums, these monuments, memorials, these things exist to remind us of our history, remind us of where we came from as a nation and as a people. Because all of us can trace our lives back to past events. And we realize that we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, many of whom gave their lives for the sake of not only earning our freedom, but also for the sake of protecting our freedom. And that's true of us as a people, but it's also true of each of us individually. We have a personal history, don't we? Each of us has a personal history that sets the stage for our present lives, for our present existence. We all have an ancestry. And that ancestry determines many of the characteristics that have shaped our lives, such as when and where we were born, such as the traditions, the beliefs that we inherit, our genetic traits. These are all part of our ancestry and part of us becoming the people that we are today. And now, thanks to modern technology, we have things like Ancestry.com, where if we're willing to spend the time and do the work, we can do some digging into our past and maybe find out some things about ourselves, our ancestry that we didn't know, and that will just kind of help us understand a little bit more about ourselves. And we do that because those connections to our past are important. And so when we study our past, we learn about our ancestry, it helps us understand more about who we are as a person. And then that understanding helps to shape our lives, how we view ourselves, and helps us understand how we got here and gives us a sense of the significance of our lives. And from a spiritual standpoint, that understanding of our past helps us to see how God has been at work, how he's worked through these past events to bring us to where we are today. Are you following me today, church? Every person that's walked the face of the earth can trace his or her existence back to people who lived and to events that took place before he or she came into the world. And that includes Jesus. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Because we tend to think of Jesus as more or less like this cosmic invader that kind of like we see dramatized in these movies that we sometimes see, that Jesus kind of like came from this other world, this other realm, this other galaxy, and he invaded our galaxy. And yet, we need to realize that what we find in the scriptures doesn't necessarily agree with that. Because God sent his son, but not from afar, but from within the context of the natural cycle of human life. God sent his son as one of us. What does the first chapter of John say? It says, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. And then later on in that same chapter it says, the Word became flesh and dwelled among us. God sent Jesus as one of us. He didn't just teleport from another realm. He descended from human beings who lived on earth before him. Are you following me today, church? You see, Jesus' story was part of the overall story of the Jews. And that's the story that we read about in the Old Testament, right? And those who wrote down this story frequently use what is called a genealogy. Somebody say genealogy. What we typically think of as a family tree. And these genealogies were an important part of the Old Testament writings, especially the books of law, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and the books of history, which are Joshua through Esther. The writers of these books often use genealogies to remind the Jews of their history and to show how God had faithfully provided for his people throughout many generations. And what we would typically find in these Old Testament narratives is that they would be preceded, these narratives about the important characters in the Old Testament, They were preceded by a genealogy showing that person's ancestry, to connect that person back to the past, back to history. Now, in the New Testament, we find two genealogies. One in Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 17, the other in Luke chapter 3, verses 23 through 28. And just as in the Old Testament, those are being used to introduce us to an important figure in history, in this case, the person of Jesus Christ. And these genealogies are connecting Jesus to Israel's past. And they're two different genealogies. They're different in many ways, and yet at the same time, they're the same. Different in that each one has a unique emphasis. One in Matthew emphasizing that Jesus is a descendant of David, the king, and that he's the heir to David's throne, and he's the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies concerning the Messiah. Luke's is a little different in that his focuses on Jesus' correlation to Adam, and it traces his line back through his father, his earthly father, that is, Joseph, back from Joseph to Adam. And he's writing in particular to a Gentile audience. And now Steve is going to share more about that in a couple of weeks coming up. But each of these genealogies has a slightly different emphasis, and yet they're the same in that the writers want the readers to realize two things about Jesus. One, that Jesus was not only divine, he was also human, right? He was both God and man. And two, he wants the Israelites in particular, Matthew wants the Israelites to know, and that Luke wants the Gentiles to know, that Jesus is part of their story. See, Jesus is the Son of God, but Jesus is also one of us. Are you following me today, church? Why is that important? Because it's important because of how we value those personal connections, right? I mean, think about elections whenever those come around. And think about how we tend to vote for the candidates that are in some way like ourselves. Whether it's because we agree with them politically, or it might be other things. You know, we vote for them because we know them, or because they look like me, they come from the same place that I come from, or they like the same things that I like. We had an election in Oak Lawn recently. We had in Oak Lawn we have what are called trustees. Here we have aldermen in Chicago. In Oak Lawn there are trustees, and there's one trustee that had been there for several years in our neighborhood. He overseeing the neighborhood where we live. And for several years, he had basically gone unopposed in the elections, and so was continually being reelected. But in this most recent election, he had a challenger, and the challenger happened to be the father of one of the students at the school that Tori and Geneva still goes there, but Tori was there as well at the elementary school that they both attended. And that influenced my decision in the election, because I have a personal connection there. I know the kid. He's a great young man, so I've gotten to know his family as a result. I've met his dad. He's just a good man. And so that personal connection is what helped me make my decision about who I was going to vote for. And we all kind of tend to do that same thing. If we have a personal connection with a candidate, that will influence our decision. My point being that the writers wanted their readers to know that this Jesus person, you have a personal connection with him. That he is part of your story. He is part of your history. He's someone whom you can relate to, and he's someone who relates to you. Are you hearing me today, church? Not only did Jesus have a history, a background, a story, but importantly as well, he knew that story. He knew his background. You see, since he was born and raised a Jew, from an early age, as all Jewish children are, Jesus would have been taught about the history of his people. So he knew the story of the fall of man in Genesis. He knew the story of the captivity. He knew the story of the kings of Israel, the suffering of the Jewish people. The same is also true regarding the Gentiles. He knew how the Gentiles had come to be despised by the Jews. He knew the stories about the prophets, the kings, the other important people from history. And he used these stories in his teaching and in his ministry. And his knowledge of history was an important, valuable tool in his ministry. And it gave him an understanding of his role, his purpose, how his life and his actions fulfilled prophecy. And so knowing these things played a major role in Jesus fulfilling his purpose in being here. It determined his actions, his decisions, his choice of words, and it informed every aspect of his ministry. Are you hearing me today, church? See, like you and me, Jesus has a history. And because of this, he is a Savior who can relate to us. He had the human experience of sympathizing with humans, both Jew and Gentile. He is able to be loving and forgiving towards sinners because the people in his background story were sinners as well. And because he entered into our story, he was in a position to change the outcome of that story. See, Jesus entered our story, made our story part of his story, and then he went to the cross and changed the outcome. Are you hearing me today, church? And what we need to realize is that our lives today as Christians are a continuation of that story. The story that began at creation. A story that is still being written even today. You see, just as God was at work throughout history to bring his Son into the world, God has also been working throughout history to bring each of us to this present moment. Do we realize that? You see, the resurrection of Jesus was the first page of a new chapter in history. You and I are spiritual descendants. Somebody say descendants. We're spiritual descendants of Christians who have lived over the past 2,000 years, whose faith has been passed down to our generation. That's why we're here today. The history of Christianity includes stories of men and women whose faith, whose courage, whose sacrifice allowed Christianity to spread even in the face of persecution. Because of how God was working through these individuals, the church still exists today. And it wouldn't be here if it had not been for their commitment to serving God. Am I right about that, church? You see, this is true for us on a collective level, but it's also true for each of us on an individual level. You see, not only do we have biological ancestors, we also have spiritual ancestors. Individuals in our past, in our history, whose lives had a direct impact on bringing us to faith in Jesus. And perhaps they were not only family members, perhaps they were teachers, preachers, friends. There may have been authors whose works we read, and those works were instrumental in shaping our faith. You see, we're not just here today simply because God brought us here. That's true. But in particular, We're here because of faithful men and women who came before us, who were faithful to God, and who wrote their part of his story to help bring us to where we are today. Are you hearing me today, church? Jesus understood his role in God's story. And he committed himself to fulfilling God's purpose in his life. And as his followers, as his spiritual descendants, we must make that same commitment. We must know what our role in the story is and dedicate our lives to fulfill our purpose in being here. Well, what does this involve? It involves knowing the scriptures, obviously. And I think we all understand that. But it doesn't just involve knowing the scriptures. It also involves knowing our history. You see, in order to fully understand how we as a church are supposed to fulfill God's purpose in our time, we have to dig deeper into the past. We need to understand more about how the church became what it is today, how it developed and adapted and changed as a result of events that took place throughout history. You see, there's a history of Christianity that too many of us know too little about. And why is that? Is it because we just think it doesn't really matter? That all we need to know is just what's in the Bible? You know, I guess one way of thinking about it is, you know how there are movies that are made that have several sequels? There's a whole lot, like the Marvel movies, right? Avengers, okay? And how, in order to understand fully what's happening in this movie, I kind of need to have seen the movie that came before it, right? Otherwise, there are things that are going to be happening that just aren't going to make any sense. Well, what was that all about? And my experience of watching that movie is not going to be as full as it could be if I haven't seen the ones that came before it. Are you following me? Well, the same is kind of true with regard to our history as a church. There are reasons why not only this church is here today, but there are reasons why the dynamics that we see of the church in the 21st century, the conflict within the church, the division within the church, even the different denominations that we have in the church, how the church seems to be on decline here in America, but growing in places like Africa and other parts of the world. There are historical reasons behind those developments. And part of our responsibility, I'll just use that word, part of our responsibility is to understand that as Christians. Because those things shape our experience today. They shape our ability to share the gospel with others today. So we need to care more about our history, know more about our history, so that we can understand our role in God's story. Are you following me today, church? And that's true for us as a people, but also in order to understand God's purpose, I need to know more about my personal history. I need to know mine, you need to know yours. You know, it's interesting. I was looking back this morning. I have some documents that my dad left for me on one of my visits. And I appreciate your prayers, those of you that have been praying for him. He's doing well. I speak to him every couple weeks or so, not as often as I should, but last time I spoke with him, he's doing well. And I've got a brother and sister that are in the area and always kind of looking after him, just kind of checking on him to see how he's doing. But he took the time a few years ago to to write down some family history. And I didn't realize it till I was going back through it this morning. My grandfather, his father, actually spent some time working here in Chicago and in Gary, Indiana. He was working in factories to help provide supplies and materials for the war. This was back in the 1940s. Okay, and so that was a part of my history, and I probably read that before, but I forgot about it and didn't notice it. But that was just interesting that here we are in Chicago now, and who knows whether we might have passed, just going through the city, where we might have passed a factory or a building where my grandfather used to work. But just knowing things like that, I don't know if I've told you about my mom and just her experience. She actually lost 2 of her children, one of whom lived just short of 1 year, one who lived just a little longer than a year. And my brother, my oldest brother, my only brother, was in between the 2 of them. Just knowing that, when you realize that that's happened in your family, it just kind of makes me look back at my experience with her and just appreciate that much more what she did for me personally. And there was this time gap between when she lost her second child and when my brother was born. When my sister was born. And it was maybe 7 or 8 years. But just to think that it took some courage for her to try again. I mean, I don't know, maybe you have experienced that or know someone who's experienced that, but it just takes some courage to try again after you've lost a child like that. And so that fact that she was willing to do that, that my dad and she both were willing to do that, and then my sister was born, and then the next year I was born, that just gives me a greater appreciation for my life, for being here. My dad just, he wanted to do what I'm doing right now. He wanted to be in full-time ministry. He was for a time, but he had to take another job in order to supply for his family, to provide for his family. He wanted to complete his master's degree. He had enrolled at Abilene Christian in Texas, started toward his master's degree, but just was not able to finish, having to take care of family and other responsibilities. And so for me to just know that, and then to be able to say that I, finished my master's and that I'm working in full-time ministry now, fulfilling his dreams, it just gives me a greater appreciation for my life. And that's part of my story, but you need to know what your story is. You need to dig a little deeper into your past and just let those things help shape your understanding of who you are and why you're here and what God's purpose is for you. Jesus knew his history. And that knowledge helped him focus on fulfilling God's mission. And he did this even though he knew it meant he would die. Yet Jesus did not die before he had fulfilled his life's purpose. You see, Jesus knew that after his death, God would send others to complete the mission that he had begun. The mission of going into all the world and making disciples of all nations. That's what Jesus did with his disciples, prepared them, and that's what he prayed for in John chapter 17. He prayed for those who would even come after them. He prayed for you and me. Others that would come to fulfill and complete the mission that he was there to begin. of making disciples. And that's our purpose, and that's part of our role in being here, is to continue that mission, to continue that work, using our unique gifts, using our unique circumstances, using the opportunities, the doors that God opens for us. Each of us can and must play a part in sharing God's love. Am I right about that, church? God sent his son to die. And yet he has sent us to live. And the how long is not as important as the how. You see what I'm saying? See, Jesus didn't get caught up in trying to prolong his earthly life. There came that point with Jesus where he knew that the time had come. He could have run away or tried to avoid it, and yet he knew that that was the moment that God had prepared him for. And so he didn't get caught up in trying to hang on to this life. And that's what happens or can happen with us if we're not careful. We can be more obsessed with trying to prolong our lives, trying to delay the inevitable, than with fulfilling our life's purpose. And don't get me wrong, it's wonderful. It's great that we have these medical developments, the technologies that allow us to live longer. You know, I have a cousin, a relative, Uncle Joe, just passed away just a few weeks ago. He didn't pass away until he had reached 103 years of age. That's a long life. Okay, and I didn't know him really well, don't have a whole lot of knowledge about his life, his background, but it's wonderful that we're in a place, in a time when it's possible, if everything falls into place, that we could live that long of a life. But again, that's not as important as how are we living our lives? What are we doing? And in particular, are we fulfilling the purpose for which God placed us here? And you could say the same about others that have lived as well, like Dr. King, right? There came that point, you see that last speech of his, and you hear what he's saying, and it's pretty obvious that he knows that the end is near for him. He knows. And yet, what did he do? He fulfilled his purpose. He did the work that God had placed him here to do. You see, church, our lives are like a relay race. And we've each taken the baton from those that came before us, right? And we've got the baton, and we're just supposed to run with that baton as fast as we can, as hard as we can, and it's only for a short time. And our goal is to just get that baton to the next runner. Just get it to the next one. We don't have to run the whole race. We just have to run our leg of the race. And that's what the writer of Hebrews is saying, right? He's saying, let us run with perseverance the race that is set out before us. And that race is unique for each and every one of us, right? The race that I'm running isn't exactly the same as the race that you're running. But we're doing the same thing. You've taken the baton, I'm taking the baton, and we're just trying to get that baton to the next runner. What I'm supposed to do in my life isn't exactly the same as what you're supposed to do. And yet we're each supposed to serve God's purposes, right? And when we do this, however that ends up looking, our lives are going to have a lasting impact. An impact that endures even after our earthly lives have ended. You see, we all want our lives to have some significance, right? None of us wants to think that we're just here for no purpose, that we're just going to live and then we're just going to die and that's going to be it. That nobody's going to remember us, that our lives will have meant nothing. We all want our lives to have significance. We want our story to be known. You know, as I was going through that museum, the African American History Museum, I just couldn't help but think, when I saw these names and stories of people that I'd never heard of before, just thinking, you know, these people probably died thinking that no one would ever know who they were or what they had done. And yet what happened? God made a way so that their story could be told. God made a way for us to know who these people are and what they did and how their sacrifice, their lives have shaped our lives. He did that for them. He can do that for us. In the Gospels, in those genealogies that we see there, some of those names of the people that are in those genealogies, they're not familiar. There's no stories, there's nothing in the Old Testament that tells us anything about who they were. They're just a name seemingly in that list of other names. And yet, they had a significant role in the story of Jesus Christ. People whom we never heard of. And yet their story continues to be told. You see, with God, anything is possible. With God, our deeds will always be known. With God, our lives are not in vain. With God, we have lives that have meaning and purpose, and that continues even after we are gone. Somebody say amen. So the question for you is, what part of God's story are you writing with your life? Is that something you've even been concerned with? Or have you been more concerned with your own personal legacy, your own personal success, your own personal notoriety? What part of God's story are you writing with your life? Have you picked up the baton from our Savior? And are you running with it? Because life is a race. Church, I want us to take a moment and I want us to have a time of prayer. And I want us to just kind of get in groups. There's a handful of us here today, and I want us to just kind of take time in our groups to pray for each other. And in your prayer groups, I want you to just share a little with each person about where you are right now, where you are as far as your understanding of God's purpose for your life. And maybe what you share is that I just don't know right now what I'm supposed to be doing, or maybe I do know what I'm supposed to be doing, what God has for me, but I'm running up against these obstacles, or I can't figure out what I'm supposed to do next. And I want you to take some time to just kind of share those things with each other. I want you to just spend some time praying for each other. I want you to spend some time just encouraging one another to stay strong in the face of the obstacles we're facing, in the face of the challenges that we're trying to endure right now, whether it's health issues, family issues, financial issues, personal issues. And just spend that time sharing and praying with one another, asking God to give us clarity, wisdom, guidance. Maybe there's a broken relationship. Maybe there's someone from our past who we feel God is prompting us to reconnect with. But we're discouraged in some way. We're scared. We're anxious. We're worried. We're bitter about something that happened, and we just can't get past these events that took place years ago. Pray about those things. So I'm going to end right here and just allow you to just group yourselves with one another. You can get up and move from where you are, or group yourselves with others right in your little area, and just spend some time praying for one another. And then after we've done that for a time, I'll close us out, and we'll be done with our service today. Amen.